Well, thanks for that wonderful introduction. It sounds pretty impressive, but the reality is I'm a hillbilly from West Virginia. I ran auto dealerships before graduate school, and so I'm a hillbilly used cars salesman with academic credentials. So you all get your wallets back at the end of this. So thanks so much for having me this morning. Gosh, I'm not sure that if you were looking to me to provide any clarity to the economy, I'm not sure that's going to happen. But it's always good to start off with a bit of humor, I think. Three kids come to my house at Halloween. One is in a blue dress with a pigtail. One has a sword and a patch over his eye, and one is in a black robe with a scythe. And so I said to the first one, "You're Elsa from Frozen," and she said, "Yes, I am." And these were little kids. And the second one, I said, "You're a pirate," and he said, "Arr, matey, I am." And the third one, I said, "And you're the guy from Scream," and he said, "No, I'm an economist." So just so you know, it's not all good. So let me tell you a moment about the Institute. I work for a think tank in Kalamazoo. If you know Brookings, if you know the Urban Institute, we're on par with them. We're a little bit smaller and maybe not as well known. The thing that's most interesting about us is we're from outside the Beltway, so we're often brought in because we are not part of that Washington insider group. I'm one of 13 PhDs on staff. The other 12 are primarily economists. There is one political scientist. Two are jointly appointed, one to Michigan State, Steve Woodbury. And let me say right now, I have no dog in the fight between State and U of M. I'm a Mountaineers fan. As I said, I'm a hillbilly. So when I present data from University of Michigan, I did not bring any plastic with me to bring home the vegetables that you might throw. So that said, we are a foundation, a think tank that looks at employment issues. I'm an applied guy, so prior to this, I was a site selector. I worked for Chambers and others. And let me also say thank you to, first, all of you for listening, and also to the Michigan Bankers Association and the Michigan Chamber of Commerce Foundation for inviting me today. The most important thing, and I'll see if I get this right, is I want to focus on the word nonpartisan in our mission statement. Everything I say today, if it sounds political, is entirely me. It is not the representation of the foundation. We are, if you're familiar with Upjohn, Pharmacia, Pfizer, our origins are from Dr. Upjohn when he funded us 75 years ago to do research into this area. So I can probably save us all a lot of time. We can get right to lunch. Is there a recession on the horizon? Maybe, and if you heard my speech a month ago, I was much less certain that something is on the horizon, but part of my talk today will be around, are we going to talk ourselves into a recession? And I think that may be the case, particularly as we listen to the news, that it isn't necessarily that there's one coming, but we may believe there's one coming, and could this be a self-fulfilling prophecy? But the other thing I would do is, certainly as we look at market volatility, as you think about what we're talking about today, decoupling markets from the fundamentals of the economy. And they're two different things. And many of my colleagues don't agree with me on this, but the reality is that I think that is the case. So looking at the national economy, we are in one of the longest cycles, and this is not a recovery cycle. This is since the last peak, so this is a peak-to-peak cycle. So we had a long cycle, 60 to 69, 81 to 90. This was the longest so far on the cycle until we got to now. We're about 132 months since the last peak. And why is this important? It is not, again, the top of the cycle that we're at, but it is through the cycle. And what makes it different is, if you look at this, if you look at the recession, or the recovery from 91 to 2001, it was about 128 months in the business cycle. The difference was the recession was only 8 months long. The recovery was 120 months long. In this business cycle, we're at 132 months, but the first 18 months were recession. So we're really only about 114, almost 115 months into the recovery. That said, if you look at many of the prognosticators, Mark Zandi at Moody's and others, nobody really sees a recession on the horizon for 2019. And really the question is, as we move back to trend, and as you can tell, I'm a geezer, so I've been around to see some trends. And when I got out of college, inflation and interest rates on mortgages were both double digits. And so in many ways, we're returning to trend. Is that necessarily bad? No. Is that what the Fed is maybe driving with these interest rates, these 25 basis point increases that we've been seeing? But the reality is that we're well into this business cycle, but there isn't anything to say that 114 couldn't be 128 months. And if we get a chance to have coffee next year at this time, let's see where we're at. So again, I like to decouple the market as much as I can from what's going on in the fundamentals. And if you look at this, and Stephanie was quite gracious in letting me resubmit this yesterday, because through this year, if you do a best fit curve, and you look at this was the introduction of TPP and solar panel and appliance tariffs. This was the steel tariff. This is the announcement of Chinese tariffs. This is the second round of tariffs with China. And on and on. Really, when you do a best fit curve through there, how much did politics really impact the market? It wasn't all that significant. We do get into this period over here. It starts to get a little bumpier, and then this kind of weirdness. And the scary part of doing this on January 3rd is we think about all this in December. The Institute's very nice. They gave us from the 21st till yesterday off, and then we come back and it's like, what the heck is going on? And so, again, not providing too much clarity, but one thing that I've heard a great deal about is sort of institutional trading that's done by algorithms, and how much of this is really driven by investor decisions versus algorithmic decisions where you get 1,000 points one day, 32 points another day, 400 points another day, up and down, these sorts of swings. And so really the question is, how do you couple these together? In fact, I don't think you do, because the fundamentals of the economy, in fact, are very, very good, and nothing changed in that between here or at this point, except my 401, and I probably get to work an extra year. So maybe that's my forecast. Instead of working 7 more years, I get to work 8 more years. So GDP is expected to remain solid. If you look across the period, these blue bars are annualized quarter outputs for GDP. You look at the last 2 quarters, and we don't have Q4 numbers, of course, but we look at something well above 3, and in one case above 4. And so we see this looking pretty good. When we go on and look at the survey of professional forecasters, if you don't follow them, they're at the Philadelphia Fed. It's about 39 or 40. It's a panel survey of individual economists and firm economists. I happen to know a few of them. Not to name drop, but fortunate. And when you really look at it, they're looking at, here's the 2 line right here, they're really looking at something in the 2.5%. So we're decelerating, but when you look back at some of these periods, it's really, are we moving back to trend when the long run since World War II has been about 1.5%, 2% real GDP growth. So real GDP, that number taken once you take inflation out of it. And so these are real GDP estimates. So we're still looking at 2.5% growth. The problem is, and if you've been following China, everybody's concerned because China GDP growth is down to 6.5%. It's still growing. Now, it's slowing that growth, and we're seeing slowing in housing markets, we're seeing slowing in auto sales, we're seeing slowing in many places. But again, is that a return to trend, and should we be afraid of returning to trend or above trend? And certainly, if we're at 2.5% growth this year, close to 3% in that margin, we are really moving back above trend, and so not to be too concerned. Is there a recession on the horizon? Everybody I've talked to essentially says 24, 36 months out, quite likely. There's a cycle to everything. Nothing lasts forever. One thing that's been different through this cycle is the number of jobs created, and if you just heard the ADP number today, 287,000 jobs, about 100,000 above expectations. But still, when you look at this, we're really looking at about 500,000 jobs a quarter. Not a real robust recovery, but why is that? There's probably a couple reasons. One is, if you look at, and we'll look at unemployment rates for Michigan here shortly, but if you look across the US, that unemployment rate is incredibly low. Where are those workers at? Labor force participation is returning back to a little bit higher area, about 62.9, and we'll talk about that for a moment. But really, where are we able to find workers at? The one thing that may drive it is, I heard today the estimates are about 3% wage growth. That may drive people into the markets. So what are we really looking at? And this is where we struggle is, will this continue to be something of a jobless recovery? Again, the ADP numbers suggest that's not the case. Where are those people finding jobs? We don't know. Or where are those people coming from to find those jobs? The jobs are out there, and I'm sorry, I just misspoke. The jobs are out there. Across the country, there are jobs available. What we don't see are where those people are coming from, because they don't seem to be in the market yet, but those jobs continue to be filled. The reality is that we're looking at something below 500,000 jobs a quarter, and there's just, unless we see significant wage growth, 3% and above, we're unlikely to see those people come into the market. So again, no fruit here from Spartans fans. We do look at the University of Michigan, RSQE. If you're not familiar with them, it's the research seminar in quantitative economics. That just rolls off your tongue. That's sort of a 65 or 70-year-old tradition. They're the longest economic forecasting unit in the country. It was founded by a future Nobel laureate. And so this is for the national economy. They were really looking at about 3% growth in the economy this year, and this is from their November forecast. They're looking at about 2.7, so they're very consistent with the Philadelphia Fed pool of folks. And then something around 2% growth in 2020. Now, I've not talked to Gabe and the team this week, so I don't know if they've modified that in any way based on some of the outcomes of the unknowns. And certainly those unknowns with the government shutdown and other things remain important. Employment's expected to grow about 1.5% over the next couple years. That's pretty consistent. Something that we'll talk a little bit more about is light vehicle sales. The long-run trend in light vehicle sales, that's cars, SUVs, although we have to question who makes cars anymore. Not many domestic manufacturers. They see 16.6, cars, SUVs, CUVs, and light trucks, my F-150, for instance. We look at this, and we see this sort of estimate to 16.6. I'd be curious to see if they revise that, because the last few months of this year, I guess it's not this year anymore, the last few months of 2018 have been fairly good. And then 17 million units, and this is, in fact, about trend. Now, has implications for the economy in Michigan and other places, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. Unemployment rate at 3.9% for this year, or for last year, 3.5% and 3.4%. This is pretty close, if not well below, full employment, and so technically the economy is at full employment. Those folks that are currently unemployed are probably frictional, meaning they've left a job to go to another job, or there's some structural stuff that they just may not be employable. And so simply because we will always have some unemployment rate, because there will always be some mismatch between the workers and the skills needed by the employers. And that becomes increasingly problematic as we look to the future. Housing starts, and I know you all are sensitive to this, many of you as bankers, and the other folks who are movers and builders and those sorts of things, continues to be relatively strong. One of the great limitations now across the country, and particularly in Michigan, are finding tradespeople to build those houses. And so to do not only housing construction, but commercial construction and other things. Example of that, my son said he wanted to be to become an electrician. I reached out to some friends in Cleveland. He lives down there. We had done a study for them. I said, how do you get this guy into an electrician's apprentice program? I got an answer back in 9 minutes. Have him call us. Because, you know, if you can pass a drug test, if you're numerate literate, and you have reliable transportation, they want you. The last thing that's probably pretty important here is the CPI inflation. And I keep hearing the pundits talk on business news. I drive a lot, so I listen to a lot of the business news on Sirius XM, not in advertising. I'm not a paid endorser. But they say inflation is low. And that's true, but that 2% is important because that's one of the triggers, along with other factors, that affect the decision to raise the Fed funds rate and quarter basis points. And so that's been driving it, and there's an expectation in the first quarter. There will be some sort of a rate increase there, but then I think there's some pressure to see some holding off for future there. So other strong fundamentals, consumer confidence is an all-time high, although if you saw the current conference board number, and we weren't able to include this, it was released yesterday, it's dropped down a little bit, but it's now down to here, which is still much higher than anything. Consumers are confident. People are very happy. If you look at the surveys, people think that they're doing well. I saw a study on Fox Business yesterday. 58% of the people said they're looking forward to 2019. It'll be a good year. But for the US, it'll be 40%. And so there's some of that NIMBY thing kind of in reverse, like my backyard is good, but the rest of the backyards maybe not so much. These blue bars are the increase, as monitored by the New York Fed, in household debt. It's important to remember that household debt is comprised of a couple different things. One of them is primarily housing costs. It's about 2/3 of the total debt. The other are revolving loans, credit cards, autos, and those sorts of things that are part of your book of business. And then also in there is student loans. My guess is that some of these bumpiness in the student loans, it may be driven by student loans here, but really when you start to see this trend down, consumers are confident, but maybe they're borrowing less. And that's not a bad thing, because one of the things that we have to worry about in this country is not only household debt, but government debt. And we'll speak about that in a moment. So Moody's Analytics looks at their risks of recession, and they put out a percentage probability of a recession in the next 6 months. Unfortunately, this is one I didn't get to update yesterday. Their recession risk went up a couple points to about 17%. And even within their remarks, and I find them to be a little on the curmudgeonly side, they point out that they really don't get worried until it gets to be about 60%, and I'll show you why in just a moment. So the long-run trend has been downward, although we've seen a bump up recently. I think their models, and they run a series of models for this, are taking into account things like the shutdown, trade, tariffs, and other things. So it's important at the Institute that we hire interns, and so we hired a 6-year-old intern to make this graph here. Actually, the joke was my president, it was his 6-year-old did this, but a 6-year-old granddaughter did this. But what this is the relationship between Moody's prediction of a recession and the actual outcome of that recession. And so along this x-axis, it's kind of fun being on a university campus. You get to say things like x-axis. And then is Moody's risk of recession, and on the y-axis is the GDP growth in the period 6 months out. And what we really saw is they're fairly good at this. They've got pretty good algorithms to think about this. And again, we've moved over into here, but still we're seeing that it's probably good economic conditions going forward. They were absolutely right. When they got to about 60% 6 months later in 2008, they did see that recession. So the correlation coefficient, I don't get to talk like that very much, was a negative 0.81, which is a fairly strong correlation. So that's my academic talk for the day. So risk factors to expansions, we'll talk to recessions. A lot of people are clock watchers. People wait for something to happen. Well, it's been 132 months, it's time for recession, right? Well, no. Expansions don't get tired, rather they end due to policy mistakes. And part of the things that they were talking about today is the government shutdown, is rising interest rates, and are tariffs an issue? And will they combine to create something? That may be the case. Or again, will we talk ourselves into some sort of recession? Some things that can affect it are tax cuts and increases, both of which were on the horizon last year and could be on the horizon this year. Federal deficits and debt, federal interest rate hikes, tariffs, and elections, and I will talk a little bit more about those in a moment. We do see the trend here. We see debt increasing. Important thing on that is this debt issue is a share of GDP. So while it looks good, hey, it's kind of downward trending, Roby. What are you thinking here a little bit? The reality is it's a share of GDP. And so while GDP is expected to increase, real GDP is expected to increase in the next 2 years, according to all the pundits, the reality is that share increases with it. On the deficit side, we see it bumping around, but the reality is that the number I've heard is that within the next few years, the deficit will exceed the cost of defense. So what we're then paying for is a significant rate, which competes many of your clients out of the market, particularly when we see rate increases, takes them out of the market. The government competes for that. We saw that, historically, and we don't need to get into that situation again. And the reality is that debt is unproductive on the government side. All it means is you're taking taxes from people who would spend things that create multipliers through the economy to fund lenders. Loan demand is down and lending standards are loosening. I'm curious to see what you all think about that. I'm hoping that, and if I look at I'm not checking my Facebook, I want to see how much time I have left. So I'm hoping you maybe have some questions or some comments on this. You probably pay much more attention to this than I do on a regular basis, but loan demand seems to be down some. Once it goes below zero, of course, that's a little bit negative. We're seeing tightening standards, or standards are loosening, sorry. Be curious to see what you think about that. This is the Senior Loan Officer Opinion Survey on Bank Lending Practices. So the one thing that does concern me a little bit is the dollar, and I think there's a lot of things going on, and I don't have a slide on this, but the Chinese currency's been down. If you kind of watch, and one of my favorite things to watch is that scroll across, Bitcoin is under $4,000, and I don't know if you think that's important or not. The reality is it's lost 75% of its value. So it's certainly not the next currency, the next currency we're going to be looking at. But if you look at the Canadian dollar, it's about 73 now. I think the pound was at 128 or 129 this morning, and the euro at 114. All of that is really down. Good for us buying stuff, except for the tariffs, of course, but good for us buying stuff because we're buying it with very, very expensive dollars, which is good on the trade side. Bad for exports. Inflation and interest rates have increased in the past 2 years. So you see, this is the CPIU, the Consumer Price Index for urban consumers. It really has been following the trend up of this blue line, which is the Fed funds rate. The thing that maybe I find most annoying is when I listen to pundits talk on business, talk about this rate increase and this fact that this is pushing things up. The reality is when you look at this and you put a best fit curve in here, inflation to interest, the reality is in real dollars, interest isn't any more expensive at this point than it was there because you start to take that out and you're maybe looking at 1% real interest rates. And so the cost of money given inflation is not changed significantly over the last few years, yet that's one of the talking points on all the news programs. So moving on to Michigan, what's happening these days in Michigan? I'm sorry for state fans again. Here's the University of Michigan forecast. They're looking at, and unfortunately they don't do a GDP statement for Michigan, and I've been arguing with them that they need to, and they've been thinking about it. Employment growth was about 1.3% in Michigan in 2018. That's their estimate. The forecast is about just under 1% for the next 2 years. Again, part of the question is, without significant pay increases, without significant wage increases, how will we get more people into the market? And this is in workers. We added about manufacturing, and this is sort of one of the staples of the state, about 6,000 workers in manufacturing employment in 2018. They're expected to have that for this year, and then actually take it down to about a third for the next year. Again, within their concerns are two things. What's happening, where are we going to find workers? And then when you look at the implications for technology and a slowing economy, what does this mean for workers? Because the issue is, as we talk to companies across the state and really across the country, people can't find workers. And so when that's the case, if you go back to a very basic Econ 101 class, you have a production function equation which says production is based on how you use capital and how you use labor. And when labor gets expensive, you substitute with capital. And when you can't find labor and you've got to fill orders and other things, you start to substitute with capital. Capital could be machines, could be processes, could be robotics and other things. Unemployment rate in Michigan last year was about 4.5% on average, expecting 3.9 and 3.8 this year. Again, more for the folks in the southeast corner of the state, but the expected inflation rate is consistent with those that we're seeing at the national rate and their national forecast, both from the Fed economists and from the folks at University of Michigan. So this is one that we keep a close eye on, and my boss and I argue about this. He goes, why do you watch this so closely? Well, the reality is depending on how you look at it, there are about anywhere from 5 to 6 additional jobs in Michigan for every one job in final assembly. So when you're rolling cars off the line, the Michigan assembly plant building trucks, and others, the plant here in Lansing, when you roll those things off the line, there's anywhere from 4 to 5 to 6 other jobs, depending upon the vehicle, that are dependent in Michigan on those jobs. Now, they may be supply chain jobs, or they may be just household jobs, the 7-Elevens, the McDonald's, and the others. And so those are the direct, the indirect, and the induced jobs. Again, the long-run trend from 2000 to 2007 was about 16.8 million units. And so we had a few bumps here. There's something like a couple natural disasters like hurricanes and storms and other things to influence sales. But if you really look over the last year, there's a trend down kind of to that natural sort of trend of about 16.8 to 17 million units, which is really consistent with what we've seen in the University of Michigan forecast. The implication for this is that we'll see probably less capital investment in new plants, and we know what GM's talking about and what's happening there, but we'll see changes in how things are made. We have to necessarily see increases in productivity, and so we see increases in technology in plants. So total U.S. employment growth continues to outpace Michigan. Overall, the U.S. has done better than the state. And this is using pre-recession employment levels and then indexing them forward. When we look at Michigan manufacturing, there's an interesting story. So we see that from 2008, the U.S. take a decline, and it's about 92%. Manufacturing employment is 92% of what it was prior to in the pre-recession period. Michigan, as you're probably aware, had its own one-state recession from 2001 to 2007, and then got caught up in the U.S. recession. And so we see this coming down from here into just about 75% employment during the depths of the recession, and then crawled back up. And now there's more people employed in manufacturing in Michigan now than there were prior to the recession. And so that's a good thing. Again, as a regional economist, I think about what happens to jobs. And so for every manufacturing job, particularly one that exports out of Michigan, and I'm not talking about necessarily exports to Canada or exports to China, but anything that moves out of Michigan helps make the multipliers, because that brings new money into Michigan. That money circulates through supply chains and households and other things. And so this is really, really important stuff. When we look at the service sector, we see Michigan, we see the service sector really growing, and this is the private service providing sector, so this doesn't include government, but does include things like healthcare, professional services, financial institutions, and those sorts of things. We see that Michigan has not done quite as well, but still certainly by 2014, 2015, had hit back to its kind of natural rate. And then gotten above where it was prior to the recession. So what sectors does Michigan seem to do well in? So this is Q3 data. The Q4 data is not available yet. And depending upon the government shutdown, it may not be available for a while. And that's not a comment pro or con on the government shutdown, just a statement of fact. We see, again, manufacturing. The size of the bubbles are the size of the employment in Michigan. And we see a couple things going on here. We see manufacturing and construction doing quite well, adding quite a few jobs across the state, and those are in thousands, so that's 10,000, 15,000 jobs. We see professional and business services, so those are architects, engineers, lenders, and others doing well. We see leisure and hospitality doing well. Of course, we see healthcare doing well, although we started to see some rationalization of healthcare, and as we see kind of people being combined. Government, without making a political statement, I'm not always sad to see government not growing big there. Other services, where we've seen some decline is, and again, keep in mind that these are thousands of jobs, so that's about 2,000 jobs is educational services, and that's private sector education. So the way that's considered government includes local school districts, state universities, and those sorts of things. So these are private educational services. Don't be alarmed at information, because you're going to say, hey, Roby, IT's growing. The reality is that IT is embedded in every one of these industries. And so information are things like book publishing, CD, DVD publishing. How many of you bought CDs and DVDs for Christmas? Okay. Internet publishing and those sorts of things. So these are, so this is nothing to worry too much about, because the IT sector continues to grow. It's increasingly important. It will be increasingly important as we move forward into 2019 and 2020. Retail, not a huge surprise there. And again, not real changes there. What we're seeing is, certainly online, what is the number? 19% online purchases were up 19% this year. What we're seeing is a bit of bricks and mortar issue. I have a friend that's chief economist for the National Retail Federation, and in asking him, if I order it online and pick it up at a Best Buy, is that an online order or is that bricks and mortar? And there's that whole segment there that they don't know what it is yet. They've not really defined, is it online, and if you return it, you order it online and Amazon drops it off or Best Buy drops it off and then I take it back to Best Buy. Is that a bricks and mortar return, or what is that exactly? What we're really seeing is that B and C mall space is just not doing well, that there's a lot of retailers that aren't doing well, but value-added retail is doing well. So we see many Main Street stores, we see a lot of interesting stuff going on in revitalized areas, but oftentimes it's value-added retail. Somebody that knows how to fit you in a suit or how to put shoes on your kids and those sorts of things. Because commodity retail can be done pretty easily through Amazon. I'm sorry to say it, and I'm a retail car guy back in the day, but you can buy about anything you want online. So in Michigan right now, or at least right before Christmas, the unemployment rate was 3.9%. We continue to see it decline. That's consistent with the forecast from RSQE, and there's about 191,000 people looking for work. Why is that important? It's important because we need to get those people into the market, but again, it's important to remember that some of those people aren't qualified for the jobs that are out there. They have certain barriers to entry that we have to help them overcome, including often transportation, childcare, they're ex-offenders, depending on what's going on with this current law with certainly marijuana and other things, how that affects the ability to be hired and pass a drug test. Part of the institute is also the Workforce Investment Board, the Michigan Works folks for 4 counties. They've been told that they're not able to use federal funds to help dispensaries find employees or grow houses or anything else. So there's still this conflict between the locals, the state, and the nationals on how some of these things play out. So the unemployment rate was 3.5% for Michigan in October of 2018. And let me see if I can back this up. This was, well, someone's getting fired when I get back today. So no, just kidding. No, that must have been, oh, this must have been I don't have a good answer for that. Well, let's just pretend that the national unemployment rate, oh, this is the national unemployment rate, sorry. I guess no one's getting fired after all. National unemployment rate was 3.5% in October. These are the rates for Michigan. As you might expect, the green rates are those areas that are really strong, particularly around Grand Rapids. Grand Rapids has been a standout for manufacturing employment and other things. And there is some seasonality to this. Not surprisingly, when we look at October in some of the UP, this is in prime tourist season, and some of this activity up in the mitten and those sorts of things. The current natural rate of unemployment, according to Fred, and you're saying, who's Fred? Those are the data folks at the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank, is 4.61. Now, trying to get the Fed to tell you when you've reached the natural or full employment rate is very difficult, but somehow they've decided to put it out there. And so what might be considered full employment nationally is 4.61. And so if you're in green, you're well below that. And so the reality is that much of Michigan is at full employment. You see how much time I have left? The national labor force participation rate, that's the folks that are 16 and over, including geezers like me who are still working, was about 63% in October 2018. This is down from October 2007, which is pre-recession when it was 66%. So a lot of people have exited the market, and there's a reason for that. One, they've aged out, so we've got 10, 11, 12 years into this. And the other is that they had enough incentives that they didn't want to come back to work. And the third is the issue of reservation wage. So economists look at what does it take to induce people into the market. And so when I used to teach economics to grad students, I would say, you know, I've got a farm in West Virginia, which I do. How many of you want to come and shovel out my barn? Nobody's hand went up. I said, I'll pay you $5 an hour. Nobody's hand went up. I said, I'll pay you $100 an hour. Hands went up, not surprisingly. And so what we did was work our way down to what that reservation was to get them into my barn to do this sort of thing. And part of the problem that we have now is that particularly those folks that got displaced in the last recession that were high wage earners through very productive manufacturing and those sorts of things, a lot of those jobs went away. There were two-tier wage systems and other things. We see that they've not been brought back into the market. Now, will 3% annual increases in real dollars start to induce people into the market? It may well be the case, but we see that in many places, particularly in the southern half of Michigan, the darker blues are where labor force participation rates are quite good, and in some cases it's close to 70%, well above the national average. We see some areas particularly in the UP and up in the mitten. This is more problematic. Part of the issue is jobs aren't there. Other issues include transportation and those sorts of things. We've been talking at the Institute about how we think about economic development in those places, and it's really unclear because some of the limitations, and I know the new governor's talked about this, is the issues of broadband and other access to things here that create jobs and what that means. So will some upward wage pressure bring more employees into the current labor market? We see production, and these are nominal wages, so they're not adjusted for inflation. These are average hourly earnings that we've seen a small uptick, but it just doesn't seem to be enough to bring people into the game. We see all employees doing well. So this includes management, this includes IT workers and others, but the reality is that production workers just don't seem to be getting those new dollars. So this is an interesting one, and so they were talking about deceleration. So this is another one of those terms that just rolls off the tongue, the National S&P CoreLogic Case-Shiller Home Price Index. The change year over year for September, which was the most recent one out until today, was 5.1% annual change. And so much as you might expect, and I'll leave this up for a minute because everybody looks to say, oh, I live down here. What's been, and these are zip codes, by the way, seeing what's going on with some areas where we've seen declines in home price, but in some of these cases, I believe, and I've got to walk over here because I said I'm a geezer, that these dark blues range in 20 to 45% annual increases. From 2016 to 2017, and these are the most current data. The lighter blues are 10 to 20%, and in some cases, these are declines between a negative 15 and a negative 40%. So there are places that we've seen price depreciation, but we're starting to see, but we've seen areas, including in my neighborhood, and I live in just a nice little neighborhood outside of Kalamazoo, where we're seeing real price appreciation in the 2 years that I've owned my house. Case-Shiller came out today, and it's at 5%. So if you looked earlier this year, you would see that it was at 5.8%. That's the overall for the U.S. annual housing price change. What we're really seeing is that deceleration. But still, a 5% change in housing price every year when you've got 2% means that real housing costs are going up 3%. That creates a huge issue for economic development. One, housing affordability, and I know that's part of your agenda today, and I'm looking forward to hearing the folks talk about it, is where do you put workers? So if you look in, and I don't know if you are familiar with Coldwater, Michigan, but that's where Clemens has their new pork processing plant. It opened last year. 800 people on a production shift. They want to add another 800 people. The problem is there's no affordable housing. They can't even find developers to build affordable housing, going back to the issue of finding construction workers and then finding, and so the company itself funded the first housing complex to help those folks, but they'd like to add a second shift because part of the issue is that capital utilization rates are not at 100%, which means that not only can you run a first shift, but you can run a second shift, and you may be able to run a third shift. The problem is most, and I'm sorry, millennials don't want to work second and third shifts. And most of the time in many parts of the country, you can't find workers because they don't have housing. So you can't even import workers to do something like that, even though the Clemens jobs pay really well. They have a 42% benefit package. So not a job I would like to do, but they have great health care. In fact, at their facility in Pennsylvania, they actually have in-building health clinics with doctors, because they were sending people who were sick to doctors. They said, why don't we just bring them here, and then people don't have to waste time going and being off work. So all that said, housing prices, are they returning to norm? I don't know. Is 5% real, or 3% real appreciation in housing, 5% in nominal increases? Is that norms? Well, certainly not in Kalamazoo, because when I bought my house in Kalamazoo, there had been no real appreciation, even though there was pressure on the housing market. And so, again, are we talking ourselves into a recession by saying, well, you know, housing prices are decelerating? Yeah, they're decelerating from 6 to 5% annual increases. So one thing that we worry about is what's happening with all of this export stuff. And so Michigan's about a $60 billion economy, about, and not surprisingly, $29 billion are exports in transportation equipment. So that's auto parts, locomotive parts, aerospace parts, and those sorts of things. And who do we send most of it to? Not surprisingly, Canada, 50%. When we look at commodity chemicals, 26% go to the EU, so that relationship is important. When we look at machinery, computer and electronic goods, electrical equipment, and fabricated metals, most of it, the largest share, goes to Mexico. So what does that mean? It means that the USMCA, or the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, is really, really important. What's interesting here is that we hear a lot about this relationship to China, and what's going on, and that's dominating the talks. What's going to happen? Are they going to impose? They had a 90-day cooling off period that started last month. Are they going to be able to put an agreement together? And these are the exports. This is not the import side. There aren't good data on the import side, but reality is it very little of the manufactured product, and we were talking this morning about the agricultural output, and we'll get to that in just a moment, but very little, relatively speaking, of the output goes to China from manufacturing for the largest by dollar groups. Now there may be some other groups that have some impact there. Where I always get caught when I'm doing interviews is someone will always bring up, well, you know, there's this company in my market that, and I have to say there will always, in any tariff things, and I say this very, very carefully, always be winners and losers. And so some people are going to benefit by these tariff changes, and some people will get hurt from it. And so I can't speak to that, but just generally at risk, this agreement really matters to much of Michigan on the export side. In this case, I am defining exports as international exports. So exposure on the agricultural side, and we were talking a little bit about it, and I was talking with some folks, and their farmers, and they rent out their space to their farmers and what it's doing to the price of soybeans. So soybeans is about a $1 million business. Does that sound right? Oh, dollars and thousands. Sorry, $1 billion business in Michigan compared to $5 billion in Illinois, $3 billion in Indiana, 2.7 in Ohio, and just under $1 billion in Wisconsin. It's about 12,000 farmers and groups of farmers and companies that are impacted by this. But really, our agricultural exports outside of soybeans to China, about $190 million. So our exposure there is relatively small. Our real export issues are $9 billion of other animal products, i.e. dairy, to Canada, and other food manufacturing, $418 million. And so these relationships are really important to Michigan. Again, it's not the Chinese relationship, but in no way do I want to minimize the importance of the soybean issue and the drop in price. The thing that I find most troubling is that China turned on a dime and quit buying U.S. soybeans, and now all the pundits say, well, it'll take years to get that business back. In a planned economy, China can say, okay, we're going to buy soybeans again. And so the question is, will they? Nobody knows. Well, Donald Trump may think he does, and that's not a political statement. So the next recession, what are we watching and factors affecting it? And much like the economy and the markets, I like to disaggregate tariffs from trade agreements. Some of my colleagues don't like to do that. The impact of announced tariffs are questionable. We think that they will certainly impact some firms more than others. There was an article in the Wall Street Journal that looked at Caterpillar. The costs of tariffs impacted them about $200 million on their bottom line. Sounds like a lot of money. It was less than 0.5% of total sales. So the impact of that, we estimated that for a couple others using input-output tables, and we found anywhere from 0.5% change in costs to less than that. And so in reality, these tariffs will affect companies differentially, but across markets shouldn't be a major thing until it starts to impact final demand, meaning the price of your TV just went up 25%, although Best Buy keeps emailing me and offering me TVs for under $500, so I don't know. The other thing is that these trade agreements, and this is why I like to look at the difference between tariffs and trade agreements. We just talked about the USMCA, and so here's a trading block situation that rectifies a lot of questions. What this did not, the USMCA did not rectify, is the steel and aluminum tariffs, and that is problematic for many firms in Michigan who use imported steel. Supposedly, they're working through more of those agreements to take care of that. The other ones are these bilateral trade agreements, and we've not been able to put something together with the UK, and I think that's a problem. And then, we continue to be closer and then pull back from blocks like the EU. Expect interest rates to rise. Certainly when we were doing this a month ago, we expected 3 increases this year to 4 increases. Now we're expecting 1. Has Jay Powell, kind of pulled back from this? You maybe have some sense to this, but we've not heard much from our friends at the Fed recently on this, but likely some sort of an increase in the first quarter, and then maybe some stability in time over the rest of the year. Tight labor markets, what's happening there? Can we continue to get employees into markets? Will that be an issue? Will that slow us down? There's a lot of concern right now that 1 million people are out of work with the federal government, and that can have something like 0.1% impact on GDP per week. The question is, if employers that you service can't find workers, what's the impact of that? And then this issue of elections have consequences. Certainly this transition to a different Congress will have implications. The implications from last year was we saw a stimulus that many of my colleagues would say overheated the economy and grew it faster than it should have through tax reductions. I'm sort of an tax reduction small guy, okay. But the issue is if those are re-implemented this year or other things, we will have an opposite effect potentially on consumer spending as well as business spending. Things that we're watching, if you're not familiar with this is Industry 4.0. Industry 4.0 is the Internet of Things. It's using automation, digitalization, and all those sorts of things. I just have to say it's coming. And the more we talk to companies in West Michigan, and where I get to spend most of my time, but across the country, we're seeing that increasing. And so while we see Industry 2.0 firms moving away from that, which is kind of manual types of things, to Industry 3.0, which is using some combination of digitalization and automation, to this Industry 4.0, and now the folks at The Ohio State University are talking about Industry 5.0. This will be an issue. And then concerns on the deficit. How do we continue to borrow money? How do we have, how do we spend $4 trillion more a year than we have? So these are all the folks that were kind enough to contribute to this. Thanks for your time today, and you've been kind enough to listen, so much appreciated. Again, thanks to the Michigan Bankers Association and to the Chamber of Commerce Foundation. So thank you. We have time? So those were my thoughts, and Stephanie's got a microphone. Does anybody have, I'm always glad to hear your opinion. You're in the field doing this. Tell me what's going on. She's coming.
What's your prediction for higher education growth and the impact of tuition on students and the increase in student debt? Is that going to cause a bust in higher education?
You know what, it's a really good question. So I've got like 3 answers that I'll do in like 5 seconds. One, I've never seen the ROI to borrowing money to go to school. And there's all that long run, here's the return on investment. I'm not sure how that plays out, but it really does help. I am concerned about that. I saw my own kids make dumb choices, and I couldn't talk them out of it. They went to a liberal arts school and paid a ton of money when they could have gotten money at a state school. The thing that I'm maybe most put off about is that a lot of kids get degrees that don't, and I'm an economist, sorry, that don't have a return on investment. So they end up as baristas with $80,000 worth of debt, and there's nothing wrong with being a barista. I really enjoy a good cup of coffee. But the reality is that, to me, if you go back to the other slide, which was the 4.0 stuff, is that what we call middle skill workers, which really offends people, but we're using the training is some sort of CTE up to pre-baccalaureate. So community colleges and all those other things, that's where the real growth in the market is. And so I think people should be investing money there. Again, my daughter is a chemist for Sherwin-Williams. She has a bachelor's and a master's. She innovates products. My son is just as smart, but he should be an electrician, not a chemist, because that's where his head is at. That's what he likes doing. But most people, and I bet if I did this in this room, and I won't do it to you, said, how many of you have kids and grandkids? And a lot of people's hands would go up. And how many of you put your arm around your kid and say, go to a trade school? Because that's where the jobs are. And there's big money. They've got electricians making 6 figures. My daughter is a chemist for Sherwin-Williams. She doesn't make 6 figures. So I think it's a real issue, but I think the question is much more about money well spent. And so if you're doing things, you're going into business and economics and engineering and those sorts of things, there's a real return on investment. The other question is, it's really in the community college to work with your hands, smart, numerate, literate kids that can pass a drug test.
Given the tight labor market, it seems, especially I'm from Ann Arbor, and we see that there's all kinds of kids coming from other countries around the world to study at Michigan, and they actually, many of them don't want to leave, they want to stay. Do you see any hope on the horizon that immigration reform could open up that part of the labor market where these kids get to come here, get their education, and decide to stay rather than go back home?
No, I think that's really a good point. I think it's important to decouple unchecked immigration from immigration that creates value. So my grandparents were immigrants. They came here. My grandfather was an apprentice baker. He came here. He worked in a bakery in Cleveland. Then he started his own business. So, I think you're absolutely right. We need to, the people with skills and those sorts of things, we need to embrace them. And we need to find ways to keep them here besides H-1Bs and all that sort of thing. It just makes lots of sense. Why we're educating people, particularly with state dollars, government dollars, and then sending back to compete against us in China and India and Bulgaria and places like that, I don't know. So I'm hopeful that makes sense. I had an opportunity to work on a project in Waco, and the number of Hispanics that we got to talk with who had come from Mexico to come and be productive in the U.S., and then in the end maybe go back to Mexico. But yeah, I think we need to delineate between, my son who could have skills but certainly hasn't developed skills. And so we don't need more of my son without skills, we need more of my son with skills, and I think that's what we need there too. Oh. One more.
Last question.
Oh, hold.
Thank you. You had made quick mention of Economy 5.0.
Mm-hmm.
What exactly does that entail in maybe quick minute?
I just reviewed an article for a peer-reviewed journal, and I still don't know. I think they're just making it up. To me, it's still Industry 4.0, but it is much more centered on the Internet of Things and machines talking to each other and stuff like that than maybe 4.0. 4.0 is kind of a concept that came out of Germany 3 or 4 years ago. So this may be the next step in the evolution. I'm a bit mixed on that, but that may be where it's going. But thanks for asking.
Well, maybe your last question. So I was looking at your graph that actually showed consumer debt. And when I was looking at the 2007, 2008 consumer debt levels, and keeping in mind that at that point, the problem was that the debt versus the collateral value was not in balance. But then when I look at the consumer debt of 2017, 2018, it seems considerably higher, or significantly higher. Is that worrisome? What's the cause of the difference? What do you think about that?
Good question. I'm only speculating here, and thanks for that last question. I'm guessing that we've seen significant appreciation in housing prices, although I've heard David Burson, who's the chief economist for Nationwide, say we're not in a housing bubble. If you ever want to go to a great session, RSQE does something in November, and David always comes and talks about this. So I guess that's part of it. Going back to this question on education, I think education's a lot more expensive now than it was. And I think my guess is consumer confidence is higher now. I mean, I don't know, I'd love to see a show of hands, and I won't do it, but I mean, kind of 2006, 2007, when, people were buying $350,000 homes with $70,000 incomes, at least in Cleveland, we were reading about it. You kind of felt something weird was about to happen. Nobody expected that to happen. So my guess is housing prices have appreciated significantly over that time, as we've seen by the S&P Case-Shiller thing. Consumer confidence up. Vehicles, I mean, the average vehicle price now is $37,000. I mean, I do okay, and $37,000 kind of makes me like, you know, I thought about buying a new truck, and the guy's like 45,000 out the door. I'm like, have a good day, and you know, I do much better than most. So, so that housing, I just think that the cost of everything have increased because I think those are nominal dollars. That would be my guess. So that will be the last one then. Thank you so much. Appreciate your time.
Well, thanks to Dr. Roby for a very interesting, timely, and thought-provoking look at our economy and a little look into the future. Before we break for lunch, we have a special treat. Rachel Eubanks has been able to join us. Rachel is the new treasurer for the state of Michigan, the first woman to hold that office, and she'd like to make a few comments before lunch.
Okay, wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. So it's an honor to come here and meet with this group. It's, of course, a priority of mine to get out and meet with the stakeholders in the state and to hear about what's important. And listening to the last speaker talk a little bit about economics and banking and ratios and fundamentals, I feel like I'm right back at home. But a little bit about me. You know you don't have bios available for me, given I'm a last-minute addition, but I'm born and raised in Michigan. I was actually born right up here the street in East Lansing, where I graduated from high school. I did go to the University of Michigan, which is a hard thing to say in this particular building. But I did get a degree there, a bachelor's degree in economics. After that, I spent 10 or 13 years actually doing public finance work, large major infrastructure, and from 2006 to 2016, I worked very closely as an outside contractor with an investment bank, working with closely the Department of Treasury on their bond issuances and debt issuances. I was very honored in 2016 to be appointed by Governor Rick Snyder to the Michigan Public Service Commission, which is a utility regulatory agency. You know, so any of the investor-owned utilities is regulated by the MPSC. And he wanted somebody on the commission that had a financial point of view in understanding the need to access capital and understanding to be able to do that in favorable terms and costs. And then I was honored, very honored, of course, to be appointed by now Governor Whitmer to be state treasurer, which is an absolute dream come true. So I'm delighted to be stepping into this role. Given that I'm about 2 days into the administration, you know, I don't have a lot of the answers. I'm sure many of you have yet, but certainly hope to continue to engage on this topic with all of our stakeholders here in Michigan. So certainly more to come there. But if there's any, you know, certainly questions that you have, the crowd has about me or my background, I'm certainly happy to answer them. Otherwise, I'm delighted to be here to listen and enjoy lunch with you all. So thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kevin Mars. I hope everyone enjoyed the wonderful lunch. I know I certainly did. Again, my name is Kevin Mars, Vice President of the American Society of Employers, a local not-for-profit trade association in Livonia. I am today's moderator for retaining and attracting Michigan's talent. Today's panelists assured me that they have all the answers to your talent shortages, and we'll have, I think, an insightful conversation today about Michigan's workforce strength, its challenges, and some solutions for attracting and retaining talent. I thought I'd go through a formal introduction of all of our speakers, but I think instead, to keep it more informal, I'll let them introduce themselves and give a little background on where they're from and the perspectives that they might be bringing to today's discussion. Start with you, Michelle.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Michelle Ruppel. I'm the Executive Director of Michigan Society of Human Resource Managers. It's an affiliation of SHRM. It's an organization of 300,000 plus members across the nation and overseas. We are the council for the chapters in the state, students as well as professional chapters of over 18 professional chapters. So we work with the HR professionals across the state. We bring them education, supply them data, and kind of are the link to the corporate national facilities. And then I'm also the owner of an organization called HR Strategies and Solutions. Thanks for having me.
Good morning, or good afternoon. I'm Sharon Miller. I'm with Consumers Energy. I'm not going to stand because I risk falling off the stage, and I would be prone to do that. I am the Michigan Talent Architect at Consumers Energy, and I actually have 3 different roles there. One of them is to focus on what are the future talent needs of our own business, and how do we make sure that there's a sufficient talent pipeline for our business. But I'm also very involved in a system called Talent Pipeline Management, bringing it to the state of Michigan and helping other employers engage in how they manage their own talent pipelines. Consumers gets in this space because if business can't grow, we don't grow. And we know the number one issue most of our business customers, particularly manufacturing and construction, face is that they can't find the talent that they need. So they brought me in. I'm a community college administrator, former. I retired, not very successfully. Obviously, I'm working again. And I call this my encore career, so I get to do this and work with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce on a number of their talent initiatives as well. So I'm pleased to be here and anxious to hear more about your industry.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sammy Lukaskevitz, longest last name in state government. And I'm from the Talent and Economic Development Department of Michigan. And my primary role is to promote the opportunities for Michigan talent in Michigan. That's both in-state and out-of-state. So we talk to a lot of students about career opportunities beyond wanting to be professional athletes or models. And we're also promoting the state of Michigan for a new generation of talent to move and live in Michigan. I've been with the state for only 2 years, so I'm relatively new to state government. I came from the NASCAR side. The state government doesn't have a lot of marketing people, so I was specifically brought in to promote Michigan for a great place to live, work, and play.
Great. With that, I'll start out with a real softball question. Given the information that we learned this morning from Dr. Robbie and the economic trends that we see in the state as far as the lack of qualified applicants, what is some of the solutions you're seeing from, or in terms of attracting, retaining the talent in Michigan? What is the current state of jobs to qualified applicants?
Shall I?
Sure.
Go ahead. Sure. Okay, so jobs to qualified applicants. I use this example at Consumers. We posted 100 positions back in 2015. We had 4,000 applicants for those 100 positions, and after screening them all, we had less than 50 who were qualified to meet the needs for that position. And that's 4,000 good applicants coming in. So we, at that time, got serious about looking at what do we need to do differently. And that's when we really started building out strategies to partner effectively with the supply chain that provides us with our workforce, to get much more integrated with them. And when I use that term supply chain, that could mean high schools, it could mean colleges and universities, unions, the military, a number of different sources of talent for us that we have now figured out how to effectively partner. And right now, we've formed some strategies that have created sole source relationships for us. We no longer advertise for that position that we used to, that we got the 4,000 applicants for. We now have 2 schools that we go to, we hire everyone we need from them, and that's that. And we don't have to advertise for it anymore, we don't have that struggle. And so we're trying to share that same strategy called talent pipeline management with other industries, really, to help them thrive in this space.
Well, we have about 811,000 career openings in the state of Michigan through 2026, and many of them are banking industry careers, everything from financial to financial planning to even marketing people. We need a lot of skilled tradesmen, we need a lot of healthcare people. The gap of talent is very wide, but there's also an awareness issue of what kind of careers are available in the state. Everybody's heard about the silver tsunami that's coming. How many of you are within about 10 years of retiring? Raise your hand. That's a lot of hands. So in the next 10 years, we have to figure out how to get the next generation of people into your position. How many, now the people who had your hands up, how many of you feel comfortable knowing that there's someone in your department or behind you ready to take your place? Okay, see significantly fewer hands. So we not only need students to get the skills to be able to take these jobs, we also need them to have the awareness of what these jobs are.
And I think both of you ladies have hit it on the mark there with strategy. Recruitment and retainment is definitely a strategic move for any organization. So this should become part of your strategic planning if it's not already. In addition to that, I would offer the suggestion, if not already, to have your human resource executive at the table with you. There's a lot of things that can come of that. In addition to that, I would say check outside of the industry. Look at what other industries are doing. I'm fear that we often get locked in our own industry, which puts us in a box. And if you look at other industries, you may see what other groups are doing that you can pull from or create other ideas from to be more creative with your recruitment as well as retaining of employees.
Sharon, you talked about some of the partnerships that you formed with Consumers Energies. What are some of the obstacles you're seeing, or from some of the other panelists might want to chime in as well, some of the obstacles of working with higher education and or other organizations to form these partnerships?
So Consumers Energy hired me as a former college administrator for a reason, because I could come in and work with the colleges. I understood how they operate. I understood their lingo. I understood their systems and barriers within them. And I think that that's one of the biggest barriers that most businesses face, is that they just, all they know about a college or a university is what they experienced as a student. And they don't really understand the machinations behind it all. And I'm not suggesting that every company or industry needs to hire former college administrators, but I think there's a reality to be faced there that there's a disconnect between them. And so I tend to think that we need to get better intermediaries, people who can work effectively between the industry and the education and bridge that gap for them. And that's part of what I'm trying to help do, is build more people like me who understand how to work between the two successfully. Just the language is a barrier and how they look at things. But I also think it's important what you mentioned, Michelle, about the looking at other industries. I'll be honest with you, as I'm out working in the schools, K-12 and post-secondary, I don't see the banking industry there. I see STEM fields, engineering, IT, healthcare. I see a lot of professionals and businesses and associations engaged in those arenas, but I don't see finance and business, and I don't see banking there. And so there's a whole race going on that others, I think, are aware of and are being proactive in engaging in the talent pipeline development and what Sammy was talking about, the messaging around the careers that are available, that I can't say for certain on a local level, but from my perspective, I don't see you in that race right now.
Yeah, there needs to be business-driven decisions helping to drive some of the education. So business has to be at the table. When colleges are starting to come up with curriculum, business has to be there. Banking has to be there, because kids are getting degrees in fields that are useless. And I have a friend, to kind of just get us off track, she has a wonderful degree from a private college in acting. She's an intern. She's been out of college for 4 years and is working part-time, I think 10 hours a week. Her dad wants her out of the house. So banking has to be at the table to help colleges with the curriculum. Same thing with getting involved in your high schools. So you can start exposing young people to careers very early. But we need business-driven solutions to help us get out of the talent gap.
One thing to add to that, if you're not in that partnership yet with colleges, universities, K-12 and so forth, start small. Start with an internship, a fellowship program, or a mentoring program. It's a great volunteer service your organization, your employees can do, and then build from there. It's something small, but it can grow into something big. Try to get on some of the boards. I just got a call from Wayne State last week, actually, and they're looking for a board to set up a whole new master's program in employment law for folks that aren't attorneys. New concept, haven't heard it before. So they're thinking out of the box a bit, but they also are going to resources where they think they can pull from. So perhaps in the partnership you develop, that might stretch your thinking a bit, as well as develop those relationships. Start small if you have to get to the table with them.
One of the observations from the recent Great Recession that was many companies, many organizations gutted their training development programs. Some of that was obviously born out of necessity. What are some of the lessons learned from that in terms of what impact that would have had or did have long-term on attraction and retention of employees?
So I'll start. I think one of the things we saw immediately was we don't have that next step for individuals to go to, or they're not ready to go to that next step. Succession planning is big. Just by a show of hands, how many of you conduct annual succession planning discussions? Okay. So look at your fellow colleagues in the room. The more you have involvement in doing some of these discussions, the better off you're going to be with that as well. Offer training and development. Your newer generations coming in, they understand they're not going to jump up this ladder. They have to look at things from a side standpoint. So that's going to look at career challenges for you as well as an employer. You're going to have to look at things you can do, maybe job rotations, site rotations, things of that nature. But it's really, really important that you get involved and start planning for the future. But don't be afraid to train. There's so many ways to train folks. It's not at sitting in a classroom, even though Kevin knows I love to do that. But there's also means of webinars, on-the-spot demand. There's so many options. I was on the MBA website the other day, and I see there's an educational wing that is offered there as well, which I think is great. So it's never too late.
So the question of letting go of your L&D or your training and development group during the recession, we did that. I know that Fiat Chrysler did that. We were involved with them at the time as a community college. It created a huge gap when things fired back up. And I think you referred to it as the silver tsunami, that gap between those of you who are retiring and the next group coming up, and do you feel confident that there's a chain there? We broke that chain very definitely when we stopped investing in training and stopped bringing new talent in for about a 7-year period of time. So today what we're doing is running as fast as we can to bring in new people, but they're all coming in entry level. So that gap that exists up here, we're having to get more creative about strategies of how to bring people like me back, to have them go retire, start collecting their pension, and then how do we get them back into keep mentoring and keep coaching and keeping our business moving forward. Knowledge transfer strategies have become real vocabulary for us, where we look at a person who's been with the company, and for us 40 years is not a short number, that's a real thing for us. We see those people and they're exiting, and the knowledge that we will lose when they go, and the mass numbers of them that are going to be going. So we now shift certain people that have been identified as key knowledge people into a knowledge transfer mode, which means we're taking them off their regular work assignments for short periods of time, 6 months before they leave, or up to 2 years, depending on the level of technical knowledge that they have. And they are specifically designating that time to capturing knowledge and transferring knowledge. So capturing is the hard part, getting documentation of what they know, and then transferring it to another person who we believe will be with us for a longer period of time. That is a new facet of our human resource efforts, is to be that focused on what are we losing in the next 5 years, and who are we losing, and what goes with them when they go. So we have to have those talent gap strategies. And then, you know, we're trying to outbid everybody else for journeymen. That's it. Basically, we didn't train our own for such a long period of time that we need to steal them from others, and so our wages are just going up and up as other people are bidding against us for the skilled workers. So, you know, if you're a journeyman right now, it's a good place to be, but on the other end of it, it's an expensive place to be.
We do a lot of data research at the state, and through our research, we're finding that the two primary types of people that we're looking for are entry-level people for jobs. We're also looking for those probably about 10 years in the field so they can manage those entry-level people. And the research that we did among those two groups of people, the number one reason why they would accept a job somewhere is because of a mentorship or some kind of internship that they had. So please don't ever underestimate the value of an internship. And then also, if there's a way that your leadership or, you know, anyone in your industry can become a mentor to young people, don't underestimate how important that is. Those are the two biggest things. And then also the other thing is pay. We got to get our people paid in line. I know you're competing for journeymen, but that's the reason why people are taking jobs, but they're staying there for the opportunity for mentorships and for those internships that they had.
You mentioned reaching out to some of the maybe more non-traditional candidates, bringing back people into the workforce. One of the stats, and Sammy stole a little bit of my thunder, 1 in 5 folks will be of retirement age by 2030. So there'll be a whole bunch of those folks in the workforce, which I think will create two-pronged problems. One, you'll have a lot of folks retiring, but also that loss of knowledge transfer. What other areas or untapped resources in terms of types of applicants might there be out there? One example that I've seen in the news recently was GM has a program called Take Two, where they're bringing people that have been detached from the workforce back in on small training programs. Any other types of applicant pools that might not be on folks' radar that should be?
Well, I think one of the things that I saw for the first time this past year that surprised me was a part-time job fair. The number of people who are like me, I'm full-time again, but when you retire, do you picture yourself wanting to work? Probably a little bit. And so the idea that there are valuable, high-paying part-time positions that people can do in project-based work, I think is a strategy that fits the new world that we function in. And we don't have enough of those kinds of careers available. And we don't think about that because we often think everyone wants full-time with benefits. And that's not always the case with the labor pools that we have available. And that's the key to me, is we need to better understand who is not working today and find out how we get them working. And so in some cases, it is the older workers. In some cases, it is the undereducated and the underprepared. And that's where those school partnerships become so vital. I've seen Vocational Village program out of Jackson Prison that is just remarkable what they're doing there, and the quality of the workers coming out and the pleasure of the employers who are hiring them. The partnership and the level of engagement there is startling, but it's a very successful program. So it's anything's possible if you know where non-working people are at.
From a retention standpoint, in order to attract, something to think about is look at your demographics within your organization. Look at where they may be falling and then offer them support in those areas. So if your demographics are in that area of retirement, perhaps start educating them on options of things that they could do either later or during their employment with you. Perhaps it's also financial planning for retirement and things of that nature. Or if it's a different generation that you've got as far as the majority of folks in there, look at what you can offer them. And through that, what you're going to find is you can take those things that you're using to retain people and spin it as a recruitment tool for those that you want to bring in, potentially. So it's a real powerful tool if you want to look at it that way as well. So
I think also, too, along the lines of Michelle saying that HR needs to be in the room, HR and the leadership of any organization have to have a real meaningful discussion of what is a qualification. A lot of times, there are people who are quite qualified to do a job, and because they lack a certain credential, maybe it's a bachelor's degree in finance. Maybe they've been an accountant at another agency for 30 years and they have an associate's degree somewhere. Very many times HR will automatically discount that candidate because they don't have the credentials that they think the leadership is looking for. So really discussing what are the skill sets that are needed in your candidates, and then seeing if those skill sets align that don't necessarily transfer on paper, but they might have the qualifications to do. Military, for example. There are military people that have a very difficult time getting certified for jobs, and I'll say state jobs for that matter. And they may have been doing those jobs in the Army for 20 years, but because they lack a certain degree, they might not automatically get disqualified from a position. So make sure HR is at the table and the leadership expectations of what those skill sets are set in advance.
one other thing to think about, right now organizations are having discussions around looking at those job descriptions to really define what the skill set is that's needed. I was in a meeting yesterday with healthcare, one of the largest employers in healthcare here in the state, and one of the things we were discussing is, do we look at a different requirement of a position, and do we really need a high school diploma in some of these areas? So immediate thought was, what can we substitute for that? A lot of organizations have changed that thought process of these are the minimum requirements to bring people in perhaps without all of those skill sets and then train them as they're coming in. And it might be one of those 30, 90-day programs where you're going to review their employment after that time. But it's another way to look at bringing folks in if you really are struggling with that area at the current time.
From our own experience, going back to the story of 4,000 applicants and 50 qualified. So the last step in the hiring process was that they had to dig a 3-by-3 foot hole. Seems like a reasonable thing to ask people who are going to be working in the field installing gas lines to do. And that's where the largest percentage of people dropped out, was they didn't either have the physical stamina to do that, or they didn't have the knowledge of how to stake it off appropriately and how to dig safely. And then when we sat down to do the root cause analysis of what went wrong, why did we only get 50 people, we got to that part in the process and went, can we not teach them how to dig a 3-by-3 foot hole? I mean, so the questioning the very premise, I won't out the person I was talking to earlier, but she shared with me that, you know, a candidate coming in with visible tattoos in the banking industry is kind of a taboo, that's not someone you'd put on the front line. And my immediate question was, why? Do your customers not have tattoos? You know, and so those are the questions we're asking ourselves as we look at the very real war for talent that is happening in Michigan is, do our criteria and our old-fashioned ways of doing it fit the new world today? You know, and is it going to be an effective workforce for our customers if we bring in people who are like the ones retiring? You know, and so really having to shift a little bit how we think. I know I'm uncomfortable with some of the people that I sit across from who are not wearing suits every day. And I'm like, wow, I've worn a suit. I had 60 suits in my closet when I retired, you know, and I work for a place now where they don't wear suits, you know, so it's a different perspective when you start thinking about the youth coming up and what they are looking for in a career. One asset that I can tell you I know you have is career pathways are pretty clear in banking from my perspective. I mean, I think you know what certifications you need to get to and what roles you have, and that's something that a lot of industries don't have. And so if I were out recruiting, that would be something I would be very vocal about, that, you know, there's a clear pathway for how you go from being a teller to being a VP if you're willing to work hard and do certain things along the way. You know, and that's not true of most industries, and so I would tout that.
You know, talking about the current employees and prospective employees, what their motivations are for work and how that's changing, particularly with some groups that we love to hate, millennials, for example. How should employers work better to understand what motivates prospective employees and how they can leverage that knowledge to better attract and retain their talent?
I hate classifying people as millennials because I'm not a millennial, but I feel like I have millennial tendencies. I mean, who doesn't want to work from home? Who doesn't want to bring their dog to work? I'm all for it. I love my iPad and all that. So I think it's not necessarily just about an age demographic that's coming up. I think people in general have changed. And I'm almost 50. And I would love to call my boss every day and be like, yeah, I forgot to wake up this morning, and I would really like to sit in an egg in my office and like just zone out under this really cool color lamp. People are different. I get asked that question a lot by the young people. People are just different, and I think in general we have to look at our teams and understand what motivates them. And some, they're motivated by money. I think that's a short-term motivator, but some it's money. Some like to have that work-life balance or that work-life flexibility that they crave. Some just want to bring their dogs in. So I think it's important that you understand everybody that works with you and for you, and know the different, some of the different things that they expect or what they want. Because if your company's not providing it, some other company will. But I will say the number one motivator for keeping a job, at least based on our research, is money. How much is someone getting paid? And the cost of living in Michigan is very low. It's much lower than it is in San Francisco or Boston or Austin or some of the cities that we're competing with. However, we're not in line with that cost of living and the pay. So we need to expect that our people are gonna wanna get paid, but know your people. I mean, because I'm old and I want to get paid also.
Just something to add to that. Look at your benefits, and it's flex in the office. And if you haven't heard of this before, maybe just Google it when you leave today. Look under when work works. And there's about 9 categories organizations from around the country apply for based upon the benefits and the offerings they have within their employer, ranging from culture to retention and things of that nature. You know, there was a study just released that said 1 out of every 6 employees is caring for someone, a caregiver, up to possibly 20 hours a week. So look at your programs. Are you offering that option for employees to take additional time if they need to for caregiving? Going back to what Sharon said, perhaps it's that part-time worker. Maybe they don't need full-time or don't need to be actively full-time in the role. You mentioned animals, paternity, right? You have an animal that's sick, it's a pet. Some organizations are allowing time for employees to go and sit at home with their pet or take them to the vet, what have you. I know for us, some of these are strange, they're new because I didn't grow up with those, but it's working. It's working for various companies. A lot of us think of Google and we go, oh no, I could never do that. None of us will. Most of us won't. But what we need to think about is how did Google do it and what did they do different with their staff, right? Are any of you conducting stay interviews at your company? Okay. It's something you may want to think about. A stay interview is when you talk to the employee before the opportunity for them to do an exit interview. So stay opportunities really did have that discussion with them, plan it. What is it you like? What is it we're doing well? What is it we can do differently? And then of course your career pathing and discussions like that. But stay interviews are really populating right now across the country in organizations. So you may want to do some research on that because that will help guide you as far as potential benefits and offerings your company has, as well as potential changes or additions. So.
I think the two of you talked about the concept of total rewards. Yep. You know, and instead of looking at it as compensation, what is the total reward package? So a millennial very typically does want to see the clear pathway forward, how they get to the next step and what are the rewards for doing so. But to me, I'm not a millennial, I'm a baby boomer. I was more interested in how flexible are you going to be with me? You know, if you really want me, can I work from home? And they let me. You know, that was part of our deal. There are things that I gave up as a part of that as well, though. You know, some of the compensation changed, the package changed for me when I made that my primary focus. So I think that the notion, and it's a popular human resource strategy, is looking at it from a total rewards perspective. Time off, promotional opportunities, travel opportunities. You know, kids these days, that's part of what they want, is to know I can get out and see the world. You know, can I get 3 weeks off my first year? I know that seems absurd. You know, to me, I went a long time with 2 weeks vacation. You know, but that's part of what they're asking for. But what can I throttle in another area to make that one possible? As opposed to it's always additive, it's not. There's a total pie. How do you want to split it up to meet the needs of that individual? It's a little more nightmarish to manage in human resources, but it's the things, the tools that we're putting in place to be able to fight the battle for the talent that we need.
And just to spin off from that, one other thing is be sure you educate your workforce on their total benefits. A lot of folks think they do because they send them a flyer once a year with a summary of their benefits or a booklet with all the benefits you offer, but that's not enough. You really need to educate them on the value of it and find out if it's really working or not. A lot of employers don't do that, so the employees say, oh yeah, they don't give me enough time off or they don't do this. It's because they don't understand the total package that they have in front of them and all the different offerings in them. So.
We've talked a lot about the HR departments, and it's often said that you can't delegate talent retention, talent development to HR. What strategies for general leadership, what information or advice would you give leadership on their role in retention strategies and attraction strategies?
So we have something called the Education Champions. Within our corporation, we have 8,000 full-time employees, and in September of last year, we did a quick ask, if you are interested in being a liaison or an education champion into the schools in your hometown or in universities, raise your hand. And within 2 days, we had 275 people from all levels of the company all over the state raise their hand. We now deploy them for career fairs, mentoring, job shadowing tours, and we have a system set up. School calls in, we push them out. as a company, our CEO has taken on the mantle for FIRST Robotics and is positioned as the co-chair of that in the state of Michigan. And she's that invested in the talent space because she sees it as it's a vital resource for the future. Not every officer at the company is engaged at that level, but there are enough of them that I feel comfortable I can access whatever I need in the moment to put out there for attraction and for development opportunities.
One thing I would suggest would be understand that HR is there to support you, and as a leader, you pretty much run the organization. When it comes to marketing and recruitment, you're all responsible for that, not just HR, not just the recruitment area or employment area. That was one of the lessons I learned early with social media, thinking, oh, we hired a marketing director, they'll handle all of our social media, right? Wrong. Social media is driven by the employees and the leadership of the organization.
Yeah, we're good now.
Uh-oh. Oh, that was great.
Okay. So real quick on that note, what I would say to all of you is be a marketer for your company. You know, there's a financial credit union, not to say their name, down in Kalamazoo, and they've done a really good job. They brought in a marketing director that has really partnered with human resources and is really marketing the organization. And they've actually worked with their leadership to do just what I've said here, which is to educate all of the leaders to be that marketing arm for the organization and understand that social media is not just by one person, it's by the entire organization. So something to think about.
I'm still back on that.
Yeah.
Change a little different tact. Speaking, and a lot has been out in the news recently about the future of work, what work is going to look like in the next 5, 10 years. With the growth of technology, specifically artificial intelligence, machine learning, how do employers need to adapt? How do their employees need to adapt to that new style of work?
So this is there we go. I thought the other guy's voice might jump in there. This is my internal project at the company right now, is looking at what is all this technology going to do to the energy industry. And AI in particular, and this term data scientists keeps coming up. And data analytics, people who understand how to identify quality data, how to manipulate it, and how to use it to solve problems, how to define future opportunities. That's probably the single most important conversation we're having right now, because there's massive amounts of data available about our customer base. And it's growing every day. And we have something called a data lake. And how we reach into that data lake and how we process what comes out of it and use it drives our future business. It's shocking, really, how quickly the next 5 years we're going to see things change in the AI space. And I've been working with Accenture quite a bit and seen some of what's coming. And it's going to be a new world. It's going to be very different. And the skill sets that all of us are going to have. I remember when computers were first a part of my life at work, and email, and then other things. There are new things coming in our work life in the next 5 years that will affect every single one of us. There's no doubt about that. And the ability to learn, to adapt, are huge. But this data analytics piece, we literally just started an analytics university internally at the company. And we've assigned a level of proficiency that every employee is going to need to have. And thank God I'm at a low level. I'm not going to have to be way up there for my job. But they're prescribing training and opportunities to help develop key talent in data analytics moving forward, because digitization has made it such a priority.
Yeah, we only project out through 2026 through the state. But I saw a stat the other day that the first graders in school now are going to be in the careers that we don't even know about yet. So that data and that automation is going to develop very quickly. And it's up to us as not only the government to be able to adapt with that and help constituents through what some of these scary things are, because people have to adapt with that as well. I think people have to be prepared to learn new skills to take on the jobs of the future. I saw an article the other day about some new cruise ship that was just launched, and the bartenders are all automated. So you go up to an iPad and you just kind of type in what drink you want, and this automated arm goes and gets the bottle and mixes your drink and then hands that to you. So bartenders might want to start looking for new careers. But we have to be flexible. I mean, me included. If I want to work beyond 65, I have to think about what my next step is going to be.
And SHRM has actually taken a step to create and develop materials to help organizations understand AI, because we're finding a lot of human resource folks don't really understand it. People think, oh, loss of jobs as soon as they hear AI. That's not always the case. So what I would suggest all of you do in the room is get familiar with it, perhaps in the industry, and then do some education around it. And like you're doing, I think it's awesome that you've applied it to employees as a requirement to take some information back or understand it. So
I think another unexpected implication of all the technology that I'm starting to see in some of the interviews I'm doing in our own company is the need for people to have an end-to-end perspective, as opposed to I'm an engineer in gas distribution and I only need to think about this. As the systems become more integrated, and I think banking's like this too probably, as those systems become more integrated, we can't have a person who just understands this. They need to have the full perspective in order for our company to thrive. And they don't have to be experts on it, but they need to understand how when they throttle this, it affects this. And that's new. That's something that's different. An electrical engineer used to be able to be pretty consolidated and focused on something, and that's just not the case anymore. So.
Well, the banking industry is, I'm completely loyal to my bank, and I think that bankers have this wonderful opportunity because their customers are probably really loyal. I've been with a company called USAA my entire life. My dad was in the military, my husband was in the Army. But they're not just my bank, they're also my financial planner. They do all our stocks. We bought a couple of things through them. They do our insurance. So there's an opportunity with the banking industry to be able to evolve into this wonderful, incredible industry. And you can keep all your people right in one industry throughout their entire careers, from IT people to bankers to tellers to financial planners to maybe you're going to sell insurance to someone. But you have this really loyal fan base, but you also have these loyal employees that will stay with you for a lifetime because there's so many career opportunities available.
And I think we only have a few minutes left, and we're going to take some questions from the audience, if there are any. Gentleman in the middle.
Well, thanks for all this. This is probably the most important topic that I can think of that our state's facing, so I could talk about this stuff all day. I was just looking, someone jogged my memory, and I just found some notes from a economic development seminar I went to talking about the top 3 reasons our college grads leave Michigan. And one is moving to a perceived cooler city. One is higher salary, but that might be an impression based on the cost of living. But the third one is slow response and uninspired hiring processes from Michigan companies. Michelle, I think I have a lot of respect for SHRM. Yeah, you've trained a lot of my HR people in the past. Talk to us a little bit about what's going on to try to really help the HR and recruiting and talent acquisition specialists to be more timely in their response, more creative in the hiring process to try to keep these people here.
Well, as you know, there's a cost involved with everything, right? The cost to hire, the cost to lose, and the cost to not make that offer. One organization I'm working with right now, what they have done, they've went back to a centralized model of recruitment. They used to have it at each of their healthcare facilities, each of the hospitals, and what they've done is they've brought it all back in-house. And with that, they intend to speed up the process, which we're seeing, it's in remarkable time how much time they've taken out of the process. Recruitment from a standpoint of not just going to a specific site to interview, but where do you live? Where do you want to work? And looking at the whole organization as a whole to determine that. So I think there's a lot being done in organizations out there. You just kind of have to think about what it is that you need, how you set your priorities, and what can you do as leaders to support your HR group to get those functions done. But I was very impressed to see a centralized model come back. We weren't sure if it was going to work, but it's actually exceeding that because they're doing their drug testing right there. They have their employee benefit discussion there. They have some training there. It's all done usually within a week or less. So
I'd be interested to know if there are metrics that most HR people are held accountable to as well. You know, we now are tracking the length of time to fill a position, an open posting, and then we're also starting to look at how much of that resides with the manager, the hiring manager, because they didn't get back to us to identify their interview team or this or that. So I think that HR is last to the table in terms, I'm new to HR, but I think all the other parts of our business are held accountable to metrics, and HR is the last ones to the table being held accountable to measure quality like that.
Yeah, we
So,
have
nope, that's it.
We have a study going out right now with Michigan businesses to try to figure out what that is. We've got 811,000 jobs open. We think there's more than that actually, because if you guys have 2 job openings, probably have 4. So we think we're a little off, but we realize that we're losing about 36% of our graduates outside the state because they're not getting back to you by HR people in a timely manner. So we're trying to figure out, is the talent gap so big in Michigan that they just can't handle the load? Do they need to hire more HR people at companies? Or is it that Midwestern, yeah, we'll get back to them. Talent can wait, because the talent won't wait. They're getting jobs in California faster than they're getting jobs in Michigan.
Hi. This question's for Sharon. Sharon, you mentioned about being more open about employees with tattoos and other things that sometimes us old-fashioned folk took into account. Well, I have one old-fashioned one I'm curious how consumers' energy is going to deal with, and that's called marijuana smoking, because I don't think you have small mistakes in your business.
So we actually, as a regulated industry and one that is safety is a cornerstone, there's no leeway there for us on the marijuana piece. We will screen for it, we will do hair follicle testing, and we will continue to maintain that standard no matter what the law is. We need to do that.
I think it's really early in the stages for that. If any of you remember when Family Medical Leave Act came about in the 90s, it took several years to kind of sort out what that was going to look like in the landscape, and right now that's what we're seeing here. Wisconsin, I know their legislative put up for a proposal to remove THC from the drug tests that were being conducted in the state. Recently, there was a ruling in Connecticut that was in favor more of the individual that was smoking pot versus the employer. So this is a change. This is at a federal level. We're seeing a switch from let's represent the organizations to kind of we're coming across the line now over to, well, really that employee might have that right. So I think it's very early in the stages. Pay attention. I think there's a lot more to come in that area.
Last question.
As more and more, I'm in a service industry, so, but this is, I think, becoming more and more of an issue also with respect to the banking industry, is a lot of our customers are demanding a more diverse workforce. Diversity and inclusion is very, very big. I'm in the legal profession, and it's a challenge for us on every level. So I'm just curious as to what are the trends you're seeing in the diversity inclusion area? Are we ever really making any strides in that area? Where are we, and what are your thoughts?
I think we are making strides in that area. I think it's somewhat industry-based. We have to look at that. We have to look at education-based as well. And that's where I think employers can really come to the table and help with that, whether it's through partnering with your local community colleges, universities, and doing some partnerships there or internships or things of that nature. I know it's a stretch for some organizations, but it's something you have to pay attention to. And it involves age, it involves various factors as well. It's not just about color, race, and religious beliefs and so forth, but continue to push towards it. We do have a road to walk still in that area, I would agree, but don't give up. Don't give up.
So we have a lot of strategies. We do a lot of stuff. in the last 15 years, we've not moved the needle one iota on our percentages. I think it's maybe an iota, but that's about it. So what is it all about then, and what are we doing? And for us, it really becomes a retention strategy for every employee at the organization, is bring your whole self to work. And so we have everything from employee resource groups for LGBTQ, we have a veterans advisory panel, we have gender neutral restrooms, we have the disabled, it's actually called Capable, our employee resource group. I mean, we've done a lot in that space to retain good people and for all of us to feel like we're welcome in our workforce. What we're starting to look at now is what's the payoff to that? If it's not moving the needle in the percentages, is it changing our performance? And what are the things we need to do to make that performance change happen? One of the best conversations I've heard on this topic was recently in Washington, D.C., former diversity and inclusion officer for Starbucks. He's written a book, and I can't remember his name nor the name of the book. So if you Google it, I'm sure it's out there. But one of the things he talked about was there's a lot of trainable things we could do for executives and leadership within companies to help them with cultivating the talent that we do bring in from a diversity and inclusion perspective. When you're the single female sitting at the table of all men and you have an idea that doesn't get heard, but then it comes out of somebody else's voice later and that person gets credit for it, that's a teachable skill for the leader to recognize that that needs to, credit matters, and where a person and what your thoughts, how they get transmitted into reality, that impacts your want and desire to stay at a company when you feel you're being given credit for your work. And oftentimes diverse populations don't. I could go on, but there's a lot of good new thinking on this.
Well, I think we're out of time, so on behalf of the Michigan Bankers Association and the Michigan Chamber Foundation, I'd like to thank our panelists for sharing their thoughts and insights, and thank everyone.
However you would like. I'll have you. You can just, why don't you come up here? So afterwards, I'm sorry. Yep, oh, that's okay. Yep, just stay here and stop. No? Not now? No, we're keeping it. We're good. All right, thank you all. I am Patricia Herndon. I'm the Senior Vice President of Government Affairs at the Michigan Bankers Association. I want to welcome our next panel on the economics of housing, supply, and demand. We have everyone joining us here. I believe Pat's down there. Great. Our panelists are Gary Heidel, the Chief Housing Investment Officer at MISTA, Pat Irving, who's the EVP of Mortgage Banking at Independent Bank, Robert Filka, who is the CEO of the Michigan Home Builders Association, and Lori Cummings is joining us to talk about a study. She is the senior researcher at MISTA, to talk about a study that we've all kind of gotten together on from these different industries to talk about the economics of housing, and that should be available, I think, later this month or early February. Housing as an issue, when we were just listening to our first speaker, the economist earlier, had brought up a story about a data processing manufacturer in Coldwater not having housing for the employees that they were bringing into the state. That is not unique to many of the other scenarios that we're seeing as Michigan competes for bringing very large employers to the state, and as we look at growing workforce here and bringing in talent from other areas, as we bring more millennials to the state who may be first-time homeowners, we're looking at some significant issues in this area that will, in the long run, impact our ability to grow and diversify our economy. So we thought we'd get a little more drilled down on this particular topic and share why it means something to all of us, and kind of give 5 or 10 minutes for each of the panelists to speak. I'm going to turn it over to Lori for a few minutes just to give you a little preface on this study and why it's being done, and some foreshadowing some of the results that we're going to be looking at. And then we'll have a little more discussion about that in general.
Thank you. Again, I'm Lori Cummings, and I'm a researcher with Michigan State Housing Development Authority. I'm going to briefly update you on a couple of research initiatives that we have going on right now. The first is the MSHDA Home Ownership Study. The goal of this study is to identify some of the obstacles to affordable home ownership in Michigan and suggest some different policy approaches to address them. To this end, we have hired a research firm, RKG Associates, formed an advisory committee which has housing industry stakeholders, including representatives from the Michigan bankers, the realtors, the home builders, and several other organizations. So we've set out to conduct this research effort, collect data, compile it into a report, and make some recommendations. Some of the basic issues we're looking at are supply factors that impact the availability of affordable housing. And when I say affordable housing, I mean for sale, single-family affordable housing as opposed to rental. And when we say affordable, how we're defining that for this research effort is households that are earning between 30% of AMI and 120% of AMI. And if you're not familiar with that convention, 30% of AMI is quite low income, and 120% of AMI is sort of middle-ish income. So, so we're looking at supply factors, in terms of home construction, the age of the housing stock, demand factors, population growth, economic trends, and affordability issues, of course, including housing cost burdens for households. Looking at several different data sources, including multiple listing service data, and we've been able to get data collected by MLS region. Relying also on data from the American Community Survey, which is the census's survey that they do. REMI data, this is data we've borrowed from the Michigan Department of Transportation, actually, that has projections of income and employment, demographics for the state. And our research company, RKG Associates, is doing interviews, or has done them actually, for stakeholders across the state, including city officials, developers, lenders, real estate brokers, employers, and then everybody on our advisory committee. We're also doing some case studies, which is a deeper dive into housing conditions and strategies. For our case studies, we've chosen Grand Rapids, Saginaw, Westland, and Alpena, which was chosen by our advisory committee through a vote to represent a diverse type of community in terms of size, location, and economic need. So the end product is going to be a written research report with recommendations. Our researchers are also surveying different things that communities and other policymakers are trying around the state to address the affordable housing needs. And this paper will be posted on our webpage, hopefully more like March or April, I would say. In our webpage, www.michigan.gov/MSHDA, or you can just Google it, because frankly, sometimes it's easier to find things that way on the MSHDA webpage. So the other initiative is a data gathering initiative. It'll provide a data tool. It's a statewide housing needs assessment. What it does is presents housing market trends both for rental and home ownership. It'll provide data from a statewide, regional, and local perspectives. We are going to be breaking that data into over 300 specific market areas. It's primarily based on data from the American Community Survey, which is census data. It'll provide data on income growth, trends in tenure, age of the housing stock, vacancies, housing values. So a lot of data that will allow decision makers to pull up a certain market area or region of the state and get some data and information that will allow them to better understand the housing market in their area. That, again, will be posted to the MSHDA webpage, hopefully in the spring of 2019. And again, you can access that from the MSHDA webpage, or simply Google MISHDA, Statewide Housing Needs Assessment. And I'm not prepared today to provide any of the initial findings. We are still in the draft phase of both of these projects. But since we are so close to having them finalized and available to all of you, I thought if you can just hold off for a couple of months. If you're interested, you can access this data from MISHDA, from the webpage. So, thank you, Lori. Anybody have any questions? Or? No? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Lori. In our exploring of this, we wanted to take a look not just at the impact on low and moderate income housing, but on housing as a whole across the state. There are a lot of factors that go into that, from the number of builders that we have post-recession in the state. And Bob, we talked last year at this same conference about skilled trades and the need for that. So if you can touch on some of that with your discussion, and then we'll get into some of the different aspects around banking and mortgage financing that have impacted this particular arena as well since the recession, from a regulatory perspective and from the number of entities that are out there doing construction lending and building new homes, but also existing housing stock and how supply and demand of that has increased in certain markets, creating bubbles, I would venture to say. And then we'll circle back with Gary and talk about some additional solutions that we can kind of from a business advocacy perspective take a look at to make sure that we're addressing needs of all of our population and the potential population coming into the state from new employers. So Bob, go ahead.
Thank you. I guess the main point that I want to stress to all of you is to really point to the dramatic change that the building industry has gone through. The production capacity of the home building industry has dramatically changed, probably won't come back for a decade or more. We lost over 60,000 workers in the industry during the downturn. And today, even though you see Tyvek wraps and a lot of construction going on around the state, new homes, the reality is we're still 50% below what normal should be for a state our size, nearly 50%. I mean, normally a state our size should be building somewhere around 28,000 new single-family homes each year just to keep up with old housing going out of, just general demographic shifts around the state. We're only going to build about 18,000 homes this year in the state of Michigan. Last year we built a little over 17,000. That's not going to change. So a picture says 1,000 words, and I think that picture is very clear. It's the worst housing recession ever in our industry's history when you look at it. And so how do you recover from that absent some dramatic changes in immigration policy or technology? There are some changes coming in the industry that I believe will allow us to increase production with fewer workers, but the reality is we're going to be stuck in a period of time where we're going to be underproducing new homes, which means obviously a lot of appreciation on the existing housing stock, which is good news for remodeling, refinancing, people taking their equity and redoing their homes. But the reality is we're seeing literally very little production for the average Michigan citizen, the kind of home that the average Michigan citizen could buy. In fact, given the dynamics and changes in the industry, there's been a lot of demand at the high end of the market. And I'm speaking in general terms, but the reality is most builders are building at the high end of the market, both for single-family housing, multifamily housing. It's all happening at the high end of the market. So we are creating a bubble. We're creating a void. We're creating a gap where that entry-level home is not being built, or even the next generation, next stage move-up home is not being built. And as a result, I think some of the results of the study that Lori highlighted, I have some guesses as to what it's going to reveal, and that is that more and more we're seeing people getting pushed out, rural areas, different areas of the state. The average commute time for workers in the Petoskey, Traverse City area, for example, survey was recently done. It's 45-minute commute each way, because people in those industries, those in particular up there, the wage levels are forcing them to move further and further away from the core city. in order to get affordability. That creates a long-term problem for us all. Many of my builders questioned our involvement in trying to push the issue forward for the need for more affordable housing, more workforce housing. And I said, look, I know you're busy building all these high-end homes, but that's going to end, or that's going to slow down, and we've got nobody coming up in that pipeline building equity that are going to buy that type of house in the future if we don't do something about it. And the reality is, given the changes in the industry, the one thing we would say, and as you as local community leaders, you're all very engaged in your local communities, I know you are, you need to be talking to your local economic development leaders, your local government leaders, and say, look, we need to look at the housing issue like we do traditional economic development. We come together as a community to try and attract job-producing companies to come into our area so we have good jobs in our area. You got to take that same approach for housing in the future if you're going to have adequate housing in your part of the state. I truly believe that, because I think you mentioned Coldwater. We took a group of builders and developers down to Coldwater to meet with their city manager and look at the numbers. And it's a simple mathematical equation. For the type of demographic of people that they have in that area and the wages of the jobs in that area, and looking at the availability of land, developable land, and the cost for new construction, you couldn't make the math work for a builder or developer to go down there just in the normal environment. Now, they're looking at some innovative strategies to try and attract that housing investment. They're talking about giving away land, helping subsidize some of the infrastructure for that housing. Without doing that or taking that approach, that kind of housing can't be built. The math just doesn't work. Housing, in the last year, new construction costs for Michigan, actually nationally, have risen close to 25–30%. So if you were looking to build a new house in 2017, that same house in 2018 would cost you 25–30% more. So we're exceeding, with the shortage of workers, building material costs rising, the lumber tariff issue in Canada, tariff issues in China. Housing for new construction, costs have risen so fast that we're creating a problem where there's just inadequate supply, and you can't make the margins work at the lower end of the housing spectrum. And again, we're not just talking affordable housing, we're talking starter homes, $200,000, $250,000, $300,000 homes. I've had many builders tell me they can't make money if they're building a home for less than $300,000 in many markets across the state. So in that environment, it really requires local ingenuity to try and do some innovative things. Grand Rapids is doing some great things. They've actually taken modular housing to a whole new level. And I think you're going to see parts of houses being built more and more in a manufacturing complex, shipped to the site, assembled on site, not manufactured housing, but different components of a house to try and lower the labor costs and labor needs to actually assemble a home. Many of those things are coming, but there's a lot of issues to deal with. I mean, appraisals, the NIMBYism, not in my backyard. A lot of people view that type of a home as lowering the value of their traditionally stick-built home. So there's lots of issues at play here, but clearly we're excited that MISHDA and many of our state government leaders are taking the initiative to try and draw attention to this problem. Michigan's always had a competitive advantage from an economic development standpoint for housing costs. We're poised to lose that advantage if we don't do something across the state. So I'm probably rambling on longer than I should, but I'd be happy to elaborate further.
So are we in the same position from the number of builders or how many homes we should be building in Michigan to our, speaking of the HR and attraction of talent, are we in the same position we are with some of the other states in the Midwest?
I think we still have an advantage, and in fact, the great example, San Francisco, I always use the anecdotal, I think there was a study recently that said you were in housing poverty if you didn't make over $100,000 in San Francisco. I know my daughter lives out there, she pays $4,000 a month rent. We're nowhere near that yet, but the potential for that exists. I think Michigan still does. The good news is every area of the country has this same problem, virtually. So if we can be leaders and get ahead of the curve and address this issue, it'll give us a better advantage for all the economic growth that we want to have for our state.
Thank you. Pat, we've had a lot of regulation and issues that have come up from a finance of homes perspective since the recession. Some argue maybe we were building too many homes right before the recession. But can you offer some perspective on some of the things that have constrained or made it more difficult on the lending side since the recession, and kind of what's going on now, some of the other hurdles when we're talking about really just those high-end homes being built on predominantly on the scale versus those that are in the 1 to 2 and 3 to 4 price ranges?
So I concur with everything you said, Bob. I'm with Independent Bank. It's a $3.2 billion bank. We're kind of an outsized mortgage operation within the bank. We did $800 million last year, of which 21% of that volume was construction lending. Our average loan is $209,000, but our average construction loan is $460,000. So there's a substantial difference there. And we don't see too many of the smaller ones. We have a lot of rehab loans that come through at a smaller dollar amount, and that's a good business. But we're running the same thing where it's taking longer. They don't have the subs that get on the site. We've got a rate lock out there. We're monitoring this thing through. We're married to that loan throughout the entire process. So there's frustrations all around. There's frustrations from those of us that are, really the support of that industry, the financing arm of it. And twice within the last year, we've actually tightened our guidelines around construction, around these customers. We expect more skin in the game. We put a higher FICO on there. And so we've taken a look at construction and said that it's just an area that we want to make sure that we have a very solid customer in. From the regulation side, I mean, it's no news. Everybody in this room has heard about all the other stuff. You see the MBA reports, how much it costs to get a mortgage loan through. Now, the numbers that you hear, that's not exactly correct. So if you really want to know how it breaks down, you look at the Midwest. You compare to other lenders around here. Now, the numbers are still outstanding. Instead of the $8,000 per loan, we're more somewhere around the $5,400 to $5,600 per loan it takes to originate, and that's all in costs and so forth. And we do those comparisons all the time. But the regulations have served, anytime you take Dodd-Frank, which was obviously written as a temper tantrum to the whole crisis, you can't have regulation from temper tantrums in such a complex business and then actually fully implement it correctly. Here's another thing, and you may or may not be familiar with mortgage departments, but what is a good error rate for a mortgage department? Because there's always going to be an error rate. So we call it our moderate compliance error rate. So industry-wide, what would that be? Now, if you're in any kind of manufacturing, this is going to horrify you, so hold on. The average for the mortgage lending industry on moderate compliance error rates is 43%. 43% of our files have a moderate compliance error rate on them. Now, that may shock you, but actually what is more shocking to me is almost 60% don't have an error rate, considering that these regulations and what they actually are, is remarkable. We're doing a phenomenal job.
Nice.
Thank you. But one of the things, and if you read the errors, you'd be like, "Are you kidding? Are you kidding?" I mean, these are no customer impact. This is often, Alice in Wonderland. But if you look at the hardcore difference in mortgage lending and what the business and the underlying bubble that you referred to lovingly is that prior to the recession, how many of those customers got a loan without actually documenting to us what they really made or had? And that doesn't take place anymore. We know what the client actually makes, what their income is, and what their reserves are, what their savings pattern is, and their credit score and so forth. But I think that one difference of fully documented industry with skin in the game is really what sets apart and doesn't create a bubble, even though in the future we are seeing a slowing. We saw a slowing this year. It's predicted to see a slowing again next year. Okay, well, we're running red hot there in the mortgage business. And just from a purchase side, the affordability index made a 10-point actually worsening over the last year. And without getting into all the details, it just means that things are getting more expensive. Here's one, I have one quote here that This is actually from a Realtor publication. And of course, everything is always good in the publications, but in this, you're going to hear over and over again, okay? Although the Freddie Mac recently reported the 30-year fixed rate is its highest average in 7 years, reaching 4.94%. Average rates were 5.97 10 years ago, 6.78 20 years ago, and 10.39% 30 years ago. And then they have to admit that the affordability concerns are still out there. You know, anytime we have this discussion about what happened 10, 20, or 30 years ago, it is completely irrelevant. I can promise you for certain that buyers today expect to have a 4 handle on a 30-year fixed interest rate. And when they hear a 5 number, everybody gets cranky. Now, for those of us a little bit older, back in the day where we celebrated when we finally got into the 6s at all, it doesn't matter. So, you know, we kind of have this historical perspective. We saw in the economist thing years and years going back. But the reality is, if you're 30 years old, your awareness cycle has only been maybe 8 years, okay? So the entire economic world is only 8 years old in your mind. And the idea of some crook bank trying to get 5% out of you is just, you know, unacceptable. So that's the market we're in now. And that's catering to my friends in the next generation. And which we're happy to do.
Well, thank you, Pat. Always entertaining, but factual. So these are concerns, and as we look at, you know, Xers and boomers and others that are able to maybe do some of those other things that are more prevalent right now in the housing market, we look at millennials, and as they're coming out of college, they're coming out with those expectations of what their 8-year history of what the financial markets are and aren't. And they're also coming out with a lot of college debt that's still quite a big hindrance when they look at debt-to-income ratios. We don't want to set people up to fail, but it's an issue. So as we look at that generation becoming first-time homeowners and wanting them to so that they can then continue that growth pattern up and build equity and buy those next homes, this is very important. So as we look from our perspective, we do need to be very cognizant in this kind of study to look at low and moderate income and where that bridge goes from MISHDA doing low and moderate income to the moderate income and starter homes that a person in their 20s and 30s is looking to purchase. So with that, I will turn it to Gary, and he can kind of share what their perspective has been on this study and the need for us to work together. We've had a lot of conversations about how does this translate when we do talk about innovative solutions to this and how we connect local government as an economic development factor. If they want to get that manufacturer or that other company into their city or into their county, how do they go about doing this and how can they facilitate it? How can we facilitate this at the state policy level? How can we facilitate it at the federal policy level? So, Gary?
Hey, that's quite a thing you handed me. Thank you, Patricia. And I do agree about what's going on with millennials and their student debt because I'm the parent who's paying that student debt. So it's hindering my lifestyle a little bit too. First of all, I'd like to say it's a real pleasure for us to be here. MISHDA has been a longtime partner with Michigan bankers going back decades. It's been a great relationship. There's probably not one thing we do that somehow you are not involved in either directly or indirectly, whether it's you're a participating lender in our single family programs, or some of you may have bought tax credits from a deal or from a syndicator, or you're through your charitable work, you provided grants to local governments and nonprofits to do things in a community. Those are all things that we're very involved in, and every time I talk to a partner that we're working with, there's always a lender that's a big part of it, including just volunteering time and expertise to help them do what they do. So it's been a great relationship. It will be an important relationship going forward during these times. You provide knowledge and influence that are very helpful, whether it's at the state level or the federal level. I know we've worked with Patricia and the bankers before on legislation at the federal level, and we've done it here at the state level. So we're really, really appreciative of your relationship we have with you. I want to talk a little in 3 different areas, and maybe a 4th. The three would be home ownership, rental development, neighborhoods, and if we have some time, and I got someone back there who's going to tell me if I talk too much, why she comes to these things with me. A little bit about opportunity zones if you're interested in hearing about this. This is something new going on at the federal level. It's creating a lot of excitement. We're not sure if it's really going to be anything yet, but there could be something there, and it might be something together we want to think about. Home ownership, we are doing gangbusters in home ownership. I want to introduce Mary Townley back there. Raise your hand, Mary. So Mary is our home ownership director, former banker. Actually, she was a banker in the first bank I became a part of, which was Citizens Bank back in Flint. We have doubled our production from a year ago, from 22 million to about 48 million. Now that's small compared to a lot what you do, but it really means something to us because we're dealing in the affordable housing market for home ownership. We find that some of the people we're doing business with are millennials between 29 and 32 years old, single females especially. And that's been a lot of what we've been doing that increase on, to a point where we're actually putting on a couple more staff to handle that volume. But that's all things that we do in conjunction with participating lenders. In rental development, and I got Andy Martin back here. Andy, raise your hand. He is the director of development, and Andy is responsible for a couple of different programs that we operate. And I want to put this in kind of the perspective of the example that was brought up by Dr. Roby, which is Coldwater. Coldwater, small community, but it's kind of typical what's happening in Michigan in small communities, but sometimes in some of the larger communities too. And that is the Great Recession, as Bob said, we lost a lot of talent, a lot of talent. And so we haven't seen a lot of good housing production over since that time. And all of a sudden, we get industries that are very interested in coming into Michigan, whether it's into Detroit or Grand Rapids or into some of our smaller communities. I mean, I am spending as much time in Coldwater and Grayling and Gaylord and Ludington as I am in Detroit or Grand Rapids. And what we're finding is that there is just not a lot of housing stock. It is tight housing markets out there in Michigan. And that's what's happened because of the Great Recession and now that we're coming out of the Great Recession. And it's been a real challenge for MISTA because also in those areas you have a lower income level, which, as you said, makes production difficult because you can't pencil out the deals and have them pay off. So what Coldwater, what was said about Clements is, yes, they did come in, they had a great product, they couldn't find enough housing, so they did finance a rental housing project in Coldwater. What we have done since that time, in the last round of our low-income housing tax credit program, how many of you are familiar with the low-income housing tax credit program? So very few. So let me tell you basically what it is. It's a rental program. We get federal low-income housing tax credits, which we apply, we provide to a developer based on a competitive operation. And what they do is it becomes subsidy in the deal. You can finance up to 70–80% of a rental development deal using the 9% tax credit program. So it's a huge subsidy. It is rent-driven, so it's the incomes of the people are below 60% of area median income. But if you've got a market in that area, that can be very critical in terms of providing affordable housing. And what that can do then is it opens up other housing opportunities for other people. So we were able to do a 9% rental development project in Coldwater to help with the housing demand in that area. One of the bigger challenges, though, is been home ownership in that area. And so actually Bob went down to Coldwater because we were being requested by the locals, you got to help us with this. And so Bob was more than willing with his team to go down there. By the way, Bob's team is just not in Coldwater. they're all over the place. So Dawn is up in Grayling, and I mean, there's becoming kind of this home builder, local government, banker kind of collaboration that's been going on about how do we deal with these problems, because that's what it's going to take to solve it, is these local collaborations and how we can get it done. And what we finally did start to, and so we got the same kind of message Bob got. It's very difficult to do a traditional stick-built home in a place like Coldwater or Grayling or some of the other places we've been to. And so more recently, primarily because of the experience that's been going on in Grand Rapids with modular housing through the Kent County Land Bank, is the State Land Bank Director, Josh Burgett, talked to us about that. And so what we've done now is we have a new initiative, kind of like what do we do now, and have it with trying to figure out what the future will be, is we are financing a modular home product. Now, we're doing it a little bit differently, and I want to raise Tanya Young. Raise your hand, Tanya. So Tanya is our Neighborhood Enhancement Program team leader, and she's responsible for this modular program. This is like very new and very new for MSHDA. This is nothing like we've ever done before, but like many of us in this room and Bob and others have done, we got to think about things differently than we ever have before. So what we realize is there is a gap in the market when it comes to modular, and that is we won't with our mortgage financing, rural development won't with their mortgage financing, and you won't with your mortgage financing. Spec housing?
Spec house, you mean for an individual?
Yeah, that's right. Well, I know you'll, let me finish.
Buyer we will.
Let me finish. And this gets back to the recession, when there was a lot of spec housing done, which no owner in mind, and I know we ended up paying back the feds almost $1 million because we got caught in that, and lenders got caught in that. So what we're doing is we'll work with a local government or a nonprofit to finance a modular home on a site that does not have to be sold for 5 years. And what that house is then used for is a model to encourage other people to come in and look at that model and then go through a lender who will do construction and mortgage financing or rural development or MSHDA. And so that's the gap we see in it. We are told by modular manufacturers that we have more capacity to build modular, and some of Bob's members probably are the people doing it.
Yeah, they're starting to do it.
Yeah, and you can reduce costs, you can build year-round. It won't be the $300,000 and $350,000 home. It'll be more like the $200,000 home. But we're getting to more of a workforce product. And that's what one of the things we're trying to address, is that workforce home ownership that we hear from some of these communities. So that's something we started. We will, matter of fact, when Tanya goes back to the office, she has a conference call with the city manager of Coldwater, who's got a lawyer on the phone. And they're going to talk about the deal that's going before the city council, to where we will provide a repayable grant to the city of Coldwater to build this one home on property they have, so there's that local coordination. And then they will be working locally with lenders and others to finance up to 3 more modular homes through the private sector. So we're just kind of priming the pump with this particular product. And then the rest of it is done by the private sector. We will do this, we're piloting this, about $1.96 million program throughout Michigan, mostly rural Michigan, because that's where we see the greater need. It turns out, though, is this particular program also has great interest in urban neighborhoods, which we had not anticipated. So we are getting people calling us from neighborhoods who want to do the same thing. It's not quite the same thing. We're trying to increase supply in smaller communities for economic development reasons. This is more about replacing properties that we either demoed, or there needs to have an upgrade in the kinds of homes that are in those urban neighborhoods. So we've had calls from Detroit, Flint, it is in Grand Rapids, Muskegon, places like that. So this is one of the 3 things this is one of the things we're doing also. One of the things we're doing that we actually learned from the banking community was we have started providing grants to nonprofit organizations to do a little bit of homeowner rehab, something that fixes up the neighborhood, makes it look more presentable, makes that neighborhood feel like they're in power to do things that need to get done to attract residents and to be able to really make the place look a lot better. What we see in trends, though, is the need for much bigger homeowner rehab programs. Michigan's housing stock, 46% of Michigan housing stock is 50 or 60 years old. So you got to think about, but that's the stock that we can't get rid of. We need to preserve it. So things that I think we would be looking at and working with you all on is how do we provide a better homeowner rehab product?
So well taken. That, and as you segued a little bit into the whole Detroit picture, we have a huge amount of housing stock that is not inhabitable at this point, but we need to get it to the point where people can live in those homes that were maybe they had a large percentage of non-owner occupied prior to the recession and then had a lot of foreclosure activity because of the recession. But we need to look at that. And so I know we're not going to have a lot more discussion, but Bob and the Homeowners Association, that has a foundation. They are working diligently to really increase skilled trades training and to recruit and bring in new blood into the industry so that we've got that going forward. I think that combined with a little bit more innovation in the modular home area and the financial industry being able to have a little more flexibility in what they can do and how we can go about helping all those different levels of incomes in being homeowners when they're ready. We always want people to be successful if they're going to buy a home. We don't want to see them unsuccessful. So these are efforts that we have. We'll be happy to share the report when it comes out. But just so we wanted you to have a little bit of additional understanding of how this whole housing impacts talent, impacts bringing new industry into the state as we try to continue our growth. So thank you all for your time today. Thank you all for your time this afternoon and this morning. I hope that you had a great experience here with us. And with that, Rob?
I'm Bob Thomas with the Michigan Chamber of Commerce, and I just want to thank all of you for starting our new year with us in the program. Thank you to all of our panelists. A lot of great information today. Especially thank you to the Michigan Bankers Association for partnering with us on this program, and thank you to our sponsors. I hope you have a lot of great takeaways that you can apply back to your own communities. This is a long-term problem that requires all of your efforts to help us solve them. So looking forward to moving those forward, and have a safe trip home. Thank you.